The neon lights of Chicago blurred through my tears the night I watched my husband whisper into another woman's ear. I made a choice to stay, never suspecting that moment would cost me 5 years of my life in a cage. Now that I have returned from the dead with a heart of stone, he wants to buy my forgiveness. But he does not understand that I do not want his love anymore. I only want his eternal regret. My name is Elena. The massive iron gate of the Illinois State Correctional Facility groaned as it slid shut behind me, sealing my past inside its concrete belly. It was the middle of a blizzard. The wind howled across the barren plains, cutting through the thin fabric of my coat like a butcher knife. This coat had been elegant 5 years ago, a relic of a life that no longer existed, but now it hung loosely on my gaunt frame, insufficient against the biting cold of reality. I took a breath. The air did not taste like freedom. It tasted of diesel fumes and bitter ash. I felt no relief, only a profound sense of displacement, as if I had stepped out of a time capsule into a world that had moved on without me. A sleek black Bentley purred to a halt at the curb, its paint gleaming in stark contrast to the gray sludge covering the road. My heart did not flutter. I knew who owned that car, but when the rear door opened, it was not my husband who stepped out. It was Marcus. He was Julian's personal attorney, a man who wore morality as loosely as his Italian ties. He held a large umbrella, shielding himself from the snow while I stood exposed to the elements. Elena, Marcus started, his voice struggling to rise above the wind. He took a step closer, extending a manicured hand. Julian wanted to be here, truly he did. But given the media situation, he thought it best I come. He has arranged everything for you. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a velvet envelope. Inside were a heavy set of keys and a black titanium credit card. "It is a penthouse in the Gold Coast district," Marcus said, offering the items to me with a pitying smile. "Fully furnished, staffed, and the card has no limit. Julian wants to make amends for the misunderstanding. He wants you to be comfortable." I looked at the items in his hand. They represented the 2 things Julian thought could solve any problem: money and distance. I looked up at Marcus. My eyes felt dry and gritty. I had no tears left to cry. Misunderstanding. I repeated the word. My voice was raspy from years of silence. Marcus shifted his weight, clearly unsettled by my dead gaze. "Look, Elena, it has been 5 years. Julian feels terrible. Just take the keys. Start over." I reached out and took the keys and the card. Marcus exhaled, a cloud of white vapor escaping his lips, thinking he had succeeded. I opened my hand and let the expensive metal objects fall. They landed with a soft plop into the dirty brown slush at our feet. "Tell him." I paused, feeling the cold seep into my bones. "Tell him that the Elena he knew died in that cell. The thing standing in front of you is just a ghost, and ghosts do not need penthouses. Elena, be reasonable. You have nowhere to go. You have no money, no connections. Do not do this to yourself." I did not wait for him to finish. I turned my back on the Bentley and the warmth it promised. I began to walk against the wind, heading toward the dilapidated bus shelter down the road. I could hear Marcus calling my name, but his voice was soon swallowed by the storm. I took a bus to the south side of Chicago. I did not belong in the gleaming towers of the north anymore. I found a room in a boarding house that smelled of mildew and stale tobacco. The landlady took my last few crumpled bills without looking at my face. The room was tiny. Peeling wallpaper hung in strips like dead skin. There was a single bed with a sagging mattress in the corner. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. The silence was deafening. In prison, there was always noise, screaming, banging, the hum of electricity. Here, the quiet felt heavy. I tried to lie down on the mattress, but the softness panicked me. It felt unstable. It felt like I was sinking, my body conditioned by 1,800 nights on a steel slab, rejected the comfort. I pulled the thin, scratchy blanket off the bed and curled up on the hard linoleum floor beneath the window. The cold from the ground seeped into my hip, a familiar pain that grounded me. I stared at the cracks in the ceiling as the city lights flickered outside. I imagined that miles away, in the glass spire of the Vestra Corporation, Julian was sitting in his office right now. He would be looking out at this same storm, holding a tumbler of scotch, waiting for a call from Marcus. I knew he felt a shiver run down his spine, a nameless dread creeping into his perfectly curated life. He did not know it yet, but the storm outside was nothing compared to the one I brought with me. I secured a job at a slaughterhouse on the industrial fringe of the city because they did not ask for identification. They paid in cash at the end of every week, handing over greasy bills that felt like they had been handled by 1,000 desperate souls before me. The work was brutal. I spent 12 hours a day scrubbing blood off the concrete floors and scraping animal fat from steel cutting tables. The air was thick with the copper tang of blood and the sour stench of animal fear. The smell clung to my hair and settled deep into my pores. But I welcomed it. It was a shield. The overpowering odor of death masked the scent of my past, hiding the woman I used to be behind a wall of visceral filth. I lived a half-life, surviving on loaves of bread that were 3 days past their expiration date and drinking tap water that tasted of rust. My back constantly throbbed, a relentless reminder of the hard labor I had endured in prison. The pain was a sharp, grinding sensation in my lower spine that flared up every time I bent down to pick up a mop, but I refused to buy painkillers. Pain was the only thing that felt real. While I was drowning in the muck, I later learned that Julian had not let me go. He had hired private investigators to track my every move, convinced that once I tasted the bitterness of poverty, I would come crawling back to his golden cage. He sat in his office at Vestra, staring at the high-resolution photographs his men had taken. There I was, the former queen of Chicago society, digging through a dumpster in an alleyway, looking for plastic bottles to exchange for a few cents. I can only imagine the blow to his ego. He must have stared at those images, his knuckles turning white. Why? He surely muttered to the empty room, baffled by my defiance. Why would she choose to live like a rat rather than take my help, Vanessa, who had climbed her way up to the position of vice president in my absence, found his obsession pathetic? I was told she leaned over his desk, tracing the line of his jaw with a manicured finger, looking at the photos of me with disgust. "Are you really still pining over that, criminal?" she asked him, her voice dripping with venom. "She is a traitor, Julian. She betrayed this company. It is embarrassing that you are still watching her. Let her rot in the filth she belongs in." Her words were meant to sting, to goad him into hatred, and they worked. Julian's confusion turned into a cold, hard anger. He could not understand that my dignity was the only currency I had left, and I would not trade it for his blood money. At the slaughterhouse, my silence made me a target. The floor manager, a burly man with wandering eyes, cornered me one afternoon in the chemical storage room. He thought that because I was poor and nameless. I was available. "You know," he wheezed, stepping too close, his hand reaching out to brush against my arm. "I could make your shifts easier. A quiet woman like you, maybe you just need the right motivation." I did not scream. I did not flinch. I simply turned and locked eyes with him. I projected 5 years of prison violence, 5 years of watching inmates fashion shivs out of toothbrushes, into that single look. It was a dead, hollow stare that promised nothing but destruction. He froze. The lecherous smile slid off his face as he realized he was standing next to something far more dangerous than he was. "Freak," He spat, backing away quickly, his hands held up in surrender. He never looked at me again. That night, a storm battered the city. The roof of my boarding house leaked, water dripping rhythmically onto the rotting floorboards. I lay curled in the corner, my body burning with a sudden, violent fever. My leg, where the bone had been fractured years ago during a riot, ached with a pulsing intensity that made me gasp for air. "Make it stop," I whispered into the darkness, clutching my knee. "Please." The fever dragged me into a delirium. The dark room dissolved, and I was back in the ballroom 5 years ago. The chandeliers were blindingly bright. I saw Julian standing near the balcony doors. He was laughing, his head thrown back, a glass of champagne in his hand. Vanessa was whispering in his ear, her hand resting intimately on his chest. In the dream, I screamed at my past self. I screamed at the woman in the expensive silk dress who stood frozen, watching her husband flirt with her rival. "Leave," I shrieked in my sleep, my body thrashing on the cold floor. Walk away, do not stay, but the memory played out as it always did. I did not leave. I stayed to fight for him, to fight for us. And because I stayed, I was there when the police arrived. Because I stayed, I was the one they framed. I sobbed in my sleep, the regret tasting more bitter than the bile rising in my throat. That was the night I lost my life, not because of what they did, but because of the choice I made to stand by a man who was already holding the knife. The news rippled through the slaughterhouse at 7 o'clock that morning. The facility had been sold. The Vestra Corporation had acquired the land and planned to level the building to erect a massive new data center. I should have fled the moment I heard the name of my husband's company, but fear and hunger are heavy chains that keep you anchored to the bottom. I stayed, keeping my head down, hoping to remain invisible in the steam and gore. Julian arrived 2 hours later. He led a phalanx of executives through the kill floor, his presence jarring against the backdrop of hanging carcasses. He wore a navy bespoke suit that fit him perfectly, his shoes polished to a mirror shine that reflected the harsh fluorescent lights. I was on my knees near the main drainage grate, aggressively scrubbing a patch of coagulated grease. I pulled the hood of my stained sweatshirt low over my forehead, shrinking into my oversized uniform to become nothing more than a shadow. Disaster struck without warning. A rusted overhead water pipe, pressurized to blast away animal waste, groaned and burst directly above where Julian was standing. My body betrayed me. It was a reflex born of 10 years of marriage, a muscle memory that 5 years of prison had failed to beat out of me. Before I could think, I lunged forward. I threw myself between Julian and the rupture, taking the full force of the spray. Freezing. Filthy water mixed with animal waste slammed into my back, soaking me instantly. But Julian remained dry. The entourage gasped. Julian looked down, stunned by the sudden intervention. I scrambled to get up, desperate to turn away, but in my panic, I slipped on the wet concrete. The hood fell back. For a split second, our eyes locked. Time seemed to stop. The noise of the machinery faded into a dull hum. "Elena," he breathed, the word escaping his lips like a prayer. His eyes widened in disbelief, scanning my face as if looking for a ghost. "Elena, is that you?" I scrambled backward, my boots sliding on the sludge. "No," I rasped, my voice cracking from disuse. I turned and ran toward the loading bay doors, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, but I was weak from malnutrition, and his security detail was fast. 2 massive bodyguards stepped in front of the exit, blocking out the light. I slammed into them and recoiled. Julian was there in an instant. He reached out and grabbed my wrists to steady me. The contact burned my skin. He looked down at my hands. These were the hands that had once played Chopin and Debussy in concert halls. Fingers that were once insured for $1 million. Now, they were red, cracked, and covered in thick calluses and jagged scars from handling rusted metal and bleach. He stared at them, his expression shifting from shock to a mixture of horror and rising fury. "Your hands," he whispered, his thumb grazing a thick scar across my knuckles. "My God, Elena, what have they done to you?" I yanked my hands away, hiding them behind my back. "Let me go." "No," Julian said, his voice hardening with authority. He turned to his head of security. "Bring the car around. Now. She is coming with us." "I am not going anywhere with you," I screamed, struggling as the guards took hold of my arms. "You are not staying in this hellhole for 1 minute longer," Julian snapped, though I could see the pain warring with the anger in his eyes. "Put her in the car." The ride to the Vestra headquarters was a blur of terrified silence. I sat pressed against the door, dripping dirty water onto the beige leather seats. When we arrived, he hustled me through a private elevator up to the top floor, bypassing the curious eyes of the staff. Inside his expansive office, the heavy door clicked shut, sealing us in. Julian took a step toward me, his hand reaching out tentatively to touch my shoulder. "Elena, please." "You are shivering," he said softly. As his hand came near, I violently recoiled, cowering into the corner of the room, my arms raised to protect my head. It was an involuntary reaction, the instinct of a woman who had learned that a reaching hand meant a blow was coming. "Do not hit me," I whimpered, my eyes squeezed shut, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "I will follow the rules. Please, just do not hit me." Julian froze. His hand hovered in the air, his face paling as he realized what my reaction meant. He looked as if I had stabbed him in the chest. I was not. His voice trembled, breaking under the weight of the realization. "Elena, I would never hurt you." Before he could finish, the office door swung open. The click of high heels on marble announced her arrival before she even spoke. "Julian, the board is waiting for the report on the land acquisition," a smooth, familiar voice said. I looked up. Vanessa stood there. She looked impeccable in a white power suit, her hair perfectly styled. She stopped when she saw me huddled in the corner, wet and smelling of the slaughterhouse. Her surprise lasted only a fraction of a second before a smile curled her red lips. It was a look of pure, triumphant contempt. "Oh," Vanessa said, looking me up and down like I was a stain on the carpet that needed to be removed. "I see the stray dog has finally found its way home." Her words stripped away the last of my defenses. The shame was hotter than the fever burning in my blood. I was trapped between the man who had failed me and the woman who had destroyed me, and I had nowhere left to run. Julian slid a thick manila folder across the polished mahogany desk. The sound of the paper scraping against the wood was loud in the silent office. I looked down, my hands still trembling from the encounter in the lobby. The name on the tab made my blood run cold. It was my father's name. I opened it with shaking fingers. Inside were medical charts, billing statements, and a photograph of my father, frail and hooked up to a ventilator in a room with peeling paint. "He is in the Sunset Care Facility on the outskirts of the city," Julian said, his voice devoid of the warmth he had shown earlier. He was back in his boardroom persona now, negotiating a deal. He had a stroke 3 years ago. He is paralyzed. Elena. He requires 24-hour care. I stared at the image, tears stinging my eyes but refusing to fall. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I bought the facility last week," Julian replied calmly. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "I own the building, the equipment, and the debt. I can ensure he receives the best specialists and experimental treatments available, or I can cut the funding, and he will be transferred to a state-run hospice where they change the sheets once a week." You would not?" I whispered, horror rising in my throat. He is an old man. He did nothing to you. I will do whatever it takes to keep you here, Julian said, his eyes darkening. I am offering you a job. You will work here, at Vestra, as part of the custodial staff. The contract is for 2 years. In exchange, I wipe your father's medical debt and ensure he lives in comfort. It is a way for you to pay back what the company lost because of the scandal, a way to restore your honor. He was lying to himself. I could see it in the twitch of his jaw. He told himself this was about honor and restitution, but I knew the truth. He wanted to keep me in a cage where he could see me. He wanted to fix me, to force-feed me redemption until I became the wife he remembered. I looked at the contract he pushed toward me. It was not an employment agreement. It was a deed of ownership. But I had no choice. My father was the only tether I had left to this world. Where do I sign? I asked. My voice dead. I scratched my signature onto the line. It felt like I was signing my own death warrant. That night, I was moved into the staff dormitory in the basement of the building. The room was small and sterile, with a single narrow bed and a small window that looked out onto a brick wall. The mattress was clean and soft, but I could not touch it. The softness felt like a trap. I pulled the thin rug from the center of the room, curled up on the hard linoleum floor, and stared at the baseboards until the sun rose. The next morning, I put on the uniform. It was a shapeless, charcoal gray jumpsuit that erased any trace of my figure. I walked into the main lobby, pushing a heavy cart filled with cleaning supplies. The lobby was filled with people I used to know, former subordinates, colleagues, people who had once attended my dinner parties. They stopped talking as I passed. I could feel their eyes boring into my back, dissecting me. Is that really her? Someone whispered loudly. Look at her! Another voice sneered. From the penthouse to the janitor's closet, I kept my head down, staring at the scuff marks on the floor. I was assigned to the 40th floor. It was a cruel joke. That was the executive suite. That was Vanessa's floor. I spent the morning scrubbing the marble tiles outside the vice president's office. I worked mechanically, a robot programmed to clean, scrub, rinse, dry, repeat. I did not speak. I did not look up. When people walked by, I stepped aside and pressed myself against the wall, making myself as small as possible. I became a ghost in a gray suit, a silent shadow that absorbed the filth of the corporate world, high above me in the security control room. I knew Julian was watching. He sat before the wall of monitors, his eyes fixed on the camera feed from the 40th floor. He watched his wife on her knees, scrubbing the floor of the empire she had helped build. He was waiting for me to cry, to scream, to storm into his office and beg for forgiveness, but I gave him nothing. No anger, no tears, just the rhythmic motion of a rag moving across stone. I was empty, and I knew that emptiness terrified him more than any scream ever could. Vanessa made a sport of my degradation. It became a daily ritual on the executive floor. She would summon me to her office under the pretense of a spill, only to look me in the eye and deliberately tip her ceramic mug over the edge of her desk. The dark, steaming liquid would soak into the pristine white carpet. Then she would drop a handful of shredded paper on top of the mess and point to the floor. "Clean it up," she would say, sipping from a fresh cup. "And use your hands. We do not want to waste good towels on a clumsy mistake." I would kneel. The coffee was often still hot enough to redden my skin, but I scooped up the wet, brown sludge with my bare fingers without a flinch. The other employees, men and women who used to fear my performance reviews, now gathered in the doorways to watch. They giggled and whispered, treating my humiliation as their midday entertainment. I shut them out. I let my mind drift back to the icy showers and the concrete walls of the state penitentiary. Compared to the threat of being shanked in the shower block for a bar of soap, Vanessa's petty cruelty was nothing. It was child's play. Then came the company luncheon. The atrium was filled with caterers and laughter. I was pushing my trash cart along the perimeter, trying to remain invisible, when Vanessa's shrill voice cut through the chatter. "My watch," she shrieked, clutching her wrist. "My diamond chopard is gone. I took it off to wash my hands in the restroom, and now it is gone." She pointed a manicured finger directly at me. She was in there. I saw her lurking near the sinks. Silence descended on the hall. 2 heavy-set security guards descended on me before I could take a breath. They did not ask questions. One of them grabbed my shoulder and spun me around, shoving me against a marble pillar. "Spread your legs," the guard barked. He patted me down with unnecessary force, his hands rough against my ribs and thighs. He dumped the contents of my pockets onto the floor, a lint roller, a crumpled tissue, and a half-eaten energy bar. The contents of my cart were upended, trash spilling out for everyone to see. I saw Julian standing at the edge of the crowd. He was watching intently, his face unreadable. He could have stopped it with a single word. He was the CEO, but he stood still, waiting. He wanted to see if I would fight back. He was testing the limits of my submission. "Clear." The guard grunted, stepping back. "She is clean." A murmur of disappointment rippled through the crowd. Vanessa did not look apologetic. She merely shrugged. "Check the trash later." She snapped. She probably dumped it. I said nothing. I knelt down and began to pick up the scattered trash, placing each item back into the bin. My movements were slow and deliberate. A shadow fell over me. I looked up to see a young man, a new hire named Mark, whom I had seen working in accounting. He looked around nervously, then crouched down, pretending to tie his shoe. He slid a plastic container toward me. "It is just pasta," Mark whispered, his voice shaking slightly. You look like you need it. Please, take it." I stared at the food. My stomach cramped with hunger, but I pushed the container back. Kindness in this place was either a trap or a weakness. I could afford neither. "No," I said flatly. Mark retreated, looking hurt. I stood up, gripping the handle of my mop to steady myself. Vanessa walked past me, leaning in close so only I could hear. Her perfume was overpowering, a sickly sweet floral scent that made me nauseous. "You have no dignity left, do you?" she hissed into my ear. "You are just a cockroach that refuses to be crushed. You know, you really should have died in prison. It would have been better for everyone, you dirty little spy." The words hit me like a physical blow. Died in prison. The phrase triggered memories that flashed before my eyes, the blood on the shower floor, the nights I prayed for death just to stop the noise in my head. My grip failed. The mop handle clattered loudly onto the marble floor. My hands began to shake, a violent tremor that started in my fingers and seized my entire body. I could not breathe. My chest felt like it was being crushed by a vice. "Enough," Julian's voice boomed across the atrium. He stepped forward, pushing through the crowd of gawking employees. He looked at my shaking hands, then at Vanessa's smug face. "Everyone back to work," he commanded. Now the crowd dispersed quickly, scurrying like frightened mice. Julian turned to me, reaching out as if to steady me. "Elena," he started, his voice lowered. I did not think they would go that far. I looked up at him. I did not see a savior. I saw the man who had let the wolves encircle me just to see if I would bleed. I looked at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. "Do not," I gasped, backing away from his touch, my voice trembling with the aftershocks of the panic attack. "Do not pretend that you care." The mandatory annual health screening was announced on a Tuesday morning. For the other employees, it was a minor inconvenience, a disruption to their coffee breaks. For me, it was a death sentence. I spent 3 days trying to dodge the appointments, hiding in the supply closet during my designated slot, and feigning a stomach virus to leave early. But at Vestra, compliance was not optional. On Friday afternoon, The head of human resources personally escorted me to the medical wing on the 12th floor, her grip on my arm tight enough to leave a bruise. The exam room smelled of rubbing alcohol and latex, a sterile scent that triggered a violent nausea in the pit of my stomach. The doctor was an older man with cold hands and no patience. He tapped his clipboard, not even looking at my face. "Ms. Elena, please remove your upper garments and sit on the table. I need to listen to your heart and lungs." I stood frozen near the door, my arms crossed tightly over my chest. I shook my head. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioner. I can keep my shirt on. You can listen through the fabric." The doctor sighed, annoyed. "That is not how this works. We need a clear reading. Please undress, or I will have to note your refusal in your permanent file." I said no. I backed into the corner, panic rising in my throat like bile. Suddenly, the door was thrown open. Julian strode in, his face thunderous. He had been monitoring the situation, as he monitored everything. He assumed my resistance was another act of defiance, or perhaps he thought I was hiding track marks from drug use. "What is this nonsense?" Julian demanded, stepping between me and the doctor. "Elena, stop acting like a child. If you are sick, we need to know. Take off the shirt. Do not make me," I pleaded, my back pressed against the cold wall. "Julian, please." He did not listen. He never listened. Impatient, he reached out and grabbed the collar of my uniform. I flinched, trying to pull away, but the movement only caused the snaps of the cheap fabric to pop open. The shirt slid down my shoulders, exposing my back to the harsh fluorescent lights. The silence that followed was absolute. Julian froze. His hand was still suspended in the air, but his eyes were fixed on my skin. He was staring at the map of hell that had been carved into my flesh. My back was a ruin. There were no smooth surfaces left. Across my shoulder blades were circular, raised welts, cigarette burns inflicted by cellmates who wanted to test how long the traitor could hold her breath. Running down my spine were jagged, silvery lines where razor blades had sliced through muscle, leaving keloid scars that throbbed when it rained, and beneath those were the deep, purple-black discolorations of internal bruising that had never properly healed, souvenirs from the boots of guards who looked the other way during beatings. In prison, a verdict of selling national secrets made you lower than a murderer. I was not just an inmate. I was a target for every patriot with a shank and a grudge. I heard Julian intake a sharp, ragged breath. He looked as if he had been struck in the face with a hammer. "My God," he choked out, his voice sounding wet and broken. "Elena, who did this to you?" The shame was hotter than any iron. I scrambled to pull the tattered shirt back up, my fingers fumbling uselessly. "Don't look at me," I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat. "Are you happy now? Have you seen enough?" My mind fractured. The white room dissolved. I was no longer in the Vestra clinic. I was back in the isolation cell. The man standing in front of me was not my husband. He was the night warden. I sank to the floor, curling into a tight ball, covering my head with my arms to protect my face. "Please," I sobbed, rocking back and forth. "I will be good. I promise I will be quiet. Do not use the baton today. Please. I cannot take it anymore." Julian stumbled back. He hit the instrument tray, sending metal tools clattering to the floor. He looked at his hands, the hands that had signed the papers to send me away, and then at me, cowering on the floor, begging a ghost for mercy. For 5 years, he had told himself that justice had been served. He had convinced himself that I was living comfortably in a minimum security facility, learning a lesson. But the wreckage on my skin told a different story. It screamed of a brutality that no amount of money could fix. He backed out of the room, his face pale as a sheet. He could not be in there with me. The guilt was suffocating him. 10 minutes later, locked in his private bathroom, Julian vomited into the sink, When he finally washed his face, the man staring back in the mirror looked haunted. He pulled out his encrypted phone and dialed a number he had not used in years. "It is me," Julian said, his voice trembling with a terrifying resolve. "I want you to reopen the investigation. All of it. The corporate espionage case from 5 years ago. I do not care how much it costs. Find out what really happened that night." I think I made a mistake. While I was dragging a heavy vacuum cleaner across the carpets of the executive floor, unaware that the universe was about to sever my last connection to humanity, Julian was finally doing the one thing he should have done 5 years ago. He was looking for the truth. He had hired a private investigator who managed to track down the former head of IT, a man who had been fired by Vanessa less than 24 hours after my arrest. They met in a dimly lit diner on the edge of the city. Julian paid him $10,000 in cash for a small, silver flash drive. This drive contained the raw server logs from the night of the gala, data that Vanessa thought she had permanently erased. Back in his office, with the blinds drawn tight against the afternoon sun, Julian plugged the drive into his laptop. He watched the lines of code scroll past his eyes, and then he saw it. The digital footprint was unmistakable. At 9:45 in the evening on the night of the incident, my user account had been accessed to transfer the classified schematics to a foreign server. But the access did not come from my terminal. It came from the secure IP address assigned to the vice president's office. Julian sat back in his chair, the air leaving his lungs. Vanessa had not just framed me. She had been the one selling the data to our competitors all along. She had used me as a sacrificial lamb to cover her own embezzlement and corporate treason. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had destroyed his wife to protect the real snake, but fate has a cruel sense of timing. Just as Julian was processing this horror, his personal phone buzzed. It was the director of the nursing home. My father had passed away in his sleep at 3 o'clock that afternoon. Julian made a decision that he thought was merciful. He decided not to tell me immediately. He wanted to arrange a lavish funeral first, to handle all the paperwork, to present me with a dignified farewell as a peace offering. He thought he could control death just as he tried to control life. But he was wrong. Down in the hallway, I felt a sudden sharp pain in my chest. It was a coldness that started in my heart and spread to my fingertips. I dropped the vacuum cleaner. I knew. I did not know how I knew. But the silence in my soul was deafening. I ran to the reception desk, my face pale and wild. "I need to call the nursing home." I gasped, clutching the marble counter. "Please, let me use the phone. My father. Something is wrong." The receptionist looked at me with disdain, but before she could speak, Julian stepped out of the elevator. He looked at me with a mixture of guilt and pity that made my stomach turn. "Elena," he said, his voice unusually soft. "Come to my office. We need to talk." "Is he okay?" I demanded, ignoring his command. "Julian, tell me he is okay." He hesitated. That hesitation was all the answer I needed, but before he could formulate his lie, the elevator doors opened again. Vanessa stepped out, holding a latte, looking bored. She saw the commotion and walked over, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Vanessa laughed, the sound echoing in the silent lobby. "Why are you making such a scene? The old man is dead. Elena, he died hours ago. Julian has already ordered the casket." The world stopped spinning. The noise of the office, the ringing of phones, the hum of the air conditioning, it all vanished. Julian spun around, his face twisting in fury. "Vanessa, shut your mouth," what she shrugged, taking a sip of her coffee. She was going to find out anyway. "Now she can stop pretending she has a reason to be here." I did not scream. I did not collapse. I stood perfectly still, the last tether that held me to this earth, the only reason I had endured the insults, The beatings and the humiliation had just snapped. I looked at Julian, who was reaching for me, and then I looked at Vanessa. My eyes were dry. "He is gone," I whispered, the words sounding like they belonged to a stranger. "Elena, listen to me," Julian pleaded, stepping closer. "I wanted to tell you gently. I wanted to take care of everything for you." I took a step back, then another. I looked down at my hands, the hands that had scrubbed their floors and cleaned their toilets to save a man who was already gone. Something inside me broke. It was not a loud break. It was the quiet, final sound of a heart turning to stone. I was finally free, because I had nothing left to lose. Vanessa's final act of malice did not break me, for I was already broken. But it shattered Julian. The moment she mocked my father's death, something in my husband's eyes shifted from regret to a terrifying, cold resolve. He did not say another word to her in the lobby. He simply turned on his heel and marched toward the elevators, his stride long and predatory. 30 minutes later, the entire building went into lockdown. The glass walls of the conference room on the top floor were usually opaque, but Julian overrode the system, broadcasting the emergency board meeting to every screen in the Vestra Tower. I stood in the janitorial closet, watching the monitor mounted on the wall as if I were watching a movie about someone else's life. Julian stood at the head of the table. Flanking him were 4 officers from the Economic Crimes Unit and the Chief of Police. Vanessa sat on his right, looking pale and nervous, her earlier arrogance evaporating under the glare of the authorities. "For 5 years," Julian began, his voice amplified through the building's speakers, low and dangerous. "We have believed a lie. Today, I burn that lie to the ground." He pressed a button. The massive screen behind him illuminated with the server logs he had purchased. Lines of code, timestamps, and IP addresses filled the display. "This is the transfer log from the night the schematics were stolen," Julian announced, pointing at the screen. "It shows the data leaving our servers, and this is the authorization key. It does not belong to Elena. It belongs to the vice president." The boardroom erupted in gasps. Vanessa stood up, knocking her chair over. "This is fake," she screamed, her voice cracking. "He is lying. He is trying to frame me because he is still in love with that convict. Sit down." "Vanessa!" Julian snapped. "No," she shrieked, backing away as the officers moved toward her. "You cannot do this to me. You liked the profits. You turned a blind eye when the stock went up. You are just as guilty as I am." "I was blind," Julian said, his voice cutting through her hysteria like a blade. "But I am not blind anymore. Get her out of my sight." The police handcuffed Vanessa right there on the live feed. She was dragged out, kicking and screaming obscenities, her dignity stripped away completely. But Julian was not finished. He turned to the camera, looking directly into the lens. It felt as if he was looking right into the closet where I stood. "I owe an apology," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "to my wife, Elena. She is innocent. She has always been innocent. And anyone who has participated in her torment is no longer welcome at Vestra." He pulled out a list, one by one. He read the names of the employees who had tripped me, mocked me, or made my life hell over the past few weeks. "You are all terminated, effective immediately," Julian declared. "Security will escort you out. And do not expect severance. I will make sure you never work in this industry again." The feed cut to black. I turned away from the screen. I did not feel a rush of victory. I did not feel the warmth of vindication. I felt nothing but a vast, echoing emptiness. I picked up a small cardboard box and began to place my few belongings inside a toothbrush, a bar of soap, and the crumpled photograph of my father I had retrieved from my wallet. The door to the janitorial closet burst open. Julian stood there, his chest heaving, sweat glistening on his forehead. He had run all the way down from the 40th floor. He looked wild, desperate, and terrifyingly hopeful. "Elena," he gasped, stepping into the small room. "Did you see I did it? I destroyed them. Vanessa is gone. She is going to prison for 20 years, and the others, they are finished." He reached for me, his hands shaking with adrenaline. "It is over, my love. I fixed it. I cleared your name. Everyone knows you are innocent now. We can finally go home." I looked at him. He was smiling, a desperate, pleading smile that begged for validation. He thought he was the hero of this story. He thought that by destroying my enemies, he could resurrect the woman he had let die. I placed the box on the shelf and turned to face him. My face was a mask of ice. "You think this changes anything?" I asked softly. "Of course it does." Julian laughed nervously, trying to grab my hand. "Justice has been served. I have given you your life back. You cannot give back what no longer exists," I said, pulling my hand away. "My father is dead, Julian, and the woman you are looking for died in a cage 5 years ago. You did not save me. You just cleaned up your own mess." I picked up my box and walked past him. He stood frozen in the doorway, the smile sliding off his face as the crushing weight of his failure began to settle on his shoulders. He had won the war, but he had already lost the only thing that mattered. The iron gates of the lakefront villa swung open, welcoming us back to the place that had once been the center of my universe. Julian had spared no expense in preparing for my return. The house smelled of fresh lilies and expensive polish. He had replaced all the furniture, erasing the 5 years of dust and neglect with a showroom perfection that felt sterile and cold. He hired a private chef to prepare the truffle risotto I used to love, and he brought in a renowned trauma therapist who sat in the library, waiting for a patient who would never speak to him. Julian was frantic in his benevolence. He moved through the house with a manic energy, trying to fill the silence with gifts. On the second morning, he placed a tablet in front of me on the breakfast table. "Look," Julian said, his finger trembling as he tapped the screen. "I transferred $10 million to your account this morning. And I have signed over 50% of my voting shares in Vestra to you. You are the majority owner now. Elena, you own the company that hurt you. You have the power." I looked at the number on the screen. It was a long string of zeros. To him, it was a fortune. To me, it was just ink on glass. I did not touch the tablet. I stood up and walked to the chaotic darkness of the living room, sitting on the edge of the sofa to stare out at the lake. The water was pitch black, a vast, unblinking eye that stared back at me. I lived in that house like a specter. Julian bought Egyptian cotton sheets with a thread count of 1,000, but I slept on the Persian rug in the corner of the bedroom. The bed felt too soft, too high, too dangerous. He filled the closet with silk dresses, but I continued to wear the simple gray sweatpants I had bought at a thrift store. I did not eat his food. I did not speak to his doctors. I simply existed, a void in the center of his perfectly reconstructed life. One evening, the silence became too much for him. Julian found me on the terrace, watching the fog roll over the water. He knelt beside me, wrapping his arms around my waist, burying his face in my lap. "Elena, please." He wept, his voice muffled by my clothes. "Talk to me. Scream at me. Do anything. We can start over. We are young. We have money. We can go anywhere in the world. I will spend the rest of my life making it up to you." I looked down at the top of his head. I felt nothing, no spark of love, no heat of hatred, just a profound exhaustion. "Julian," I said, my voice flat and hollow. He looked up, hope flaring in his red-rimmed eyes. "Tell me," I continued, looking past him at the dark water. "Can your $10 million buy back 5 years of my youth? Can your 50% stock option go to the morgue and buy back the breath of my father?" Julian flinched as if I had slapped him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The reality of his impotence crashed down on him. He realized then that he was trying to put a price tag on a soul. He sat back on his heels, covering his face with his hands. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. When he finally spoke, his voice was a broken whisper. I have to tell you something I have never admitted to myself until now." I waited. "That night," Julian stammered, looking at the ground. "The night of the gala, the night you were arrested, I did not just trust Vanessa because she was my vice president. I trusted her because for a moment, I wanted her." He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face, confessing his sin in hopes of absolution. I was flattered. He choked out. "She made me feel powerful. When she whispered in my ear, when she touched my arm, I liked it. I was distracted by her. I was so busy enjoying the attention that I did not see what she was doing to you. I let her in. Elena. I opened the door for the devil because my ego was hungry. He waited for me to explode. He expected me to slap him, to rage, to finally show some emotion. But his confession did not ignite a fire in me. It only extinguished the last flickering candle of the past. "I know," I said softly. You are not angry." He asked, bewildered. "Anger requires passion," I replied, standing up and smoothing the wrinkles in my shirt. "And I have none left for you. You were not a victim, Julian. You were an accomplice. And that is why I can never stay." I turned and walked back into the house, leaving him kneeling on the cold stone of the terrace. His confession had not cleansed him. It had only confirmed what I already knew. The man I loved had died 5 years ago, killed by his own vanity. The man on the terrace was just a stranger with a checkbook, and I owed him nothing. The blizzard that descended on Chicago that night was apocalyptic. The wind howled against the reinforced glass of the villa like a pack of wolves trying to tear the structure down. It was fitting weather for the end of the world. Julian stumbled through the front door at 2 a.m. He was soaked to the bone, his expensive coat heavy with melting snow, and he reeked of aged scotch. He did not even take off his shoes. He walked straight into the living room where I sat in the dark, watching the storm rage over the Black Lake. He collapsed at my feet. The great CEO, the man who controlled billions of dollars, fell to his knees on the carpet and buried his face in his hands. "Do it," he sobbed, his voice cracking with a drunken desperation. "Scream at me." "Elena, break something. Hit me, please, just hit me. I cannot take this silence anymore. It is killing me." I looked down at him. My expression did not change. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were observing a stranger having a breakdown. "Why won't you fight?" he screamed, grabbing the hem of my sweatpants. "Punish me. I deserve it. Just show me you are still in there." I stood up slowly, pulling away from his grasp. I walked over to the marble fireplace, where the flames were dying out. I turned to face him. My eyes were clear, dry, and cold enough to freeze the blood in his veins. "You have it all wrong," I said, my voice steady and quiet. "You think Vanessa is the one who destroyed me? No, it was you." Julian froze, looking up at me with red, swollen eyes. "That night," I continued, the words falling from my lips like stones. "When you chose to lean in and whisper to her, when you chose to flirt with her right in front of me, you opened the door for the devil to walk in. You gave her the permission she needed. And when the police came, when they put the handcuffs on my wrists, your silence was the knife that finished me off." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the check for $10 million and the heavy iron key to the villa. I placed them gently on the coffee table. "I do not hate you anymore, Julian," I said, "because hate requires emotion. Hate requires energy. And I am already dead. You cannot kill a corpse twice." I walked toward the heavy oak front door. The sound of my footsteps on the hardwood floor was the only sound in the house. No! Julian scrambled to his feet, knocking over a vase. He ran after me, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Elena, wait, you cannot go out there. It is a blizzard, you will freeze. I opened the door. The wind roared into the hallway, carrying biting snowflakes that stung my face. The cold was a relief. It felt clean. Julian grabbed my arm, his grip desperate. Please, I can fix this. We can go to therapy. I will do anything. I stopped and turned to look at him one last time. I looked deep into the eyes of the man I had once promised to love forever. I saw his fear, his guilt, and his overwhelming selfishness. If you have even a shred of conscience left, I whispered, let me go. That is the only restitution I will accept. Julian looked at me. He saw the absolute void in my eyes. He realized in that moment that keeping me here, trapping me in this mausoleum of memories, would be the greatest crime he had ever committed. His hand trembled, and then, slowly, his fingers uncurled. He let go. Goodbye, Julian. I stepped out into the night. The darkness swallowed me instantly. The wind pushed against me, but I walked forward, putting one foot in front of the other, leaving the warmth, the money, and the man behind me. I did not look back. The next morning, the sun rose over a world buried in white. Julian woke up in the master bedroom of his massive estate. He had his company back. He had the truth. He had his fortune, but as he walked through the silent halls, screaming my name, only the echo answered him. He had everything, yet he had lost the only thing that gave his life a soul. I took a Greyhound bus 3 days later to a small town in the mountains of Montana. I cut my hair and changed my name. I found a job in a small, dusty library where the only sound is the turning of pages. I live in a small cabin with a wood stove. I do not have a lot of money, and I have no friends. But every morning, when I wake up and drink my coffee in the silence of the mountains, I breathe. I am alone. But for the first time in 5 years, I am free. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to hear from you. Please comment below and let me know where you are tuning in from and share your thoughts on Elena's decision. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit the hype button to help this story reach more people. Your support means the world to us.